Even if we made wise decisions in the past, that doesn't mean that we can mindlessly replicate those decisions right now in the present to deal with a changing future. Because none of us know what's going on in the final analysis, because the future is different than the past, really. We have to talk about what to do all the time. Some programs you cannot predict, right? You cannot predict how they're going to end. You have to run them.
That's what we face, potential, right? You know that. You know that the future is unstructured. You have a potential within you that can meet that, and there's a potential that characterizes the future. You meet it with eyes open and with truthful speech.
Don't pollute your thoughts with deceit. You compromise your own wisdom. You're warping the mechanism that orients you in the world. Do you really want to do that?
There isn't much deviation from the straight and narrow path if you're going to play that game, because there's just too many ways of falling into trouble, and there's way more ways of falling into trouble than not falling into trouble. And the thing is, you know it's the case. You know it. You know it. Because you do not admire yourself if you're deceitful. You admire yourself when you have those rare moments in your life where you can actually stand up and say what's true, regardless of the cost.
You speak truthfully, and you watch what happens, and you take your consequences. You know, and maybe you hope and have some faith that in the final analysis, things will work out in your favor. Faith isn't believing in things you regard as ridiculous, sacrificing your intellect. It's a decision. I think the right solution to the most serious problems is to be found at the level of the individual. The ultimate goal for me is the encouragement of the individual. If you want to help someone, the best way to help someone is not to give them advice, but to listen to them. I do monologues, but I pay attention to the audience, right? I'm always talking to individual people in the audience and watching their reactions and listening to the audience as a whole. Comedians, before they hit the road, and this is virtually invariably the case, they have their new routines, so their corpus of potentially funny jokes, and then they do 200 shows. The audience either laughs or doesn't. And if you're listening, you collect all the jokes that people laugh at. If you do that 200 times, you have nothing but hilarious material. But you listen. Humor is a mysterious phenomenon. There's an element of transcendence about it, right? Because you can laugh at yourself. And that's in some sense the highest form of humor. And so it's so interesting that we can criticize and elevate ourselves at the same time, and that we find that intensely pleasurable. If you listen, people tell you what they have to say, and then you get wise because you collect all that. If I pay attention to them and listen, they will tell me something in like 10 seconds that I need to know.
And that's exactly what you need to know. And again, it's not arbitrary. It's not an arbitrary set of propositions. It's predicated on the observation of successful and unsuccessful patterns of behavior over very, 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 very long stretches of time. So there's a behavioral platform, and then there's a narrative representation of that platform.
And so you want to help someone. Well, first of all, you decide that you're aiming towards help. You don't mess about with people's destiny. You do not know where they're headed. Like your statements, your questions should be honest. And if you ask people questions and you really listen, they will untangle themselves.
People think of free speech as kind of like a decoration, something like that in your life. And it's not that at all. It's not the ability to speak truth to power, although it is also that. It's not that. It's way more than that. Free speech is how you think.
You have something to say, and we would have to figure out what it is that you have to say.
There's no shortage of ways to live in the world. That's a morally relativistic stance. And there's something to that, obviously, because people differ in occupations, and they differ in outlook, and so forth. They differ in political beliefs. So there's obviously many ways that we can thrive in the world.
We kind of experience life as if we're tossed into it, thrown into it.
We're trying to watch how it is that we act when we act properly, and figure out how to do it as individuals. And the first way we do that is to code it in stories. That's what stories are for. That's what great literature is for. That's why there are great villains and great heroes in great literature. Because you want to know how to be a great hero unless you want to be a great villain. We're fragile and damageable and imperfect in multiple dimensions all the time. And that often just gets worse. Lots of things get worse as you get old, for example. The dramatic patterns are then written down, and then you can step back from them with your consciousness, and you can start to analyze them for the rule-based content.
You have an arbitrary range of talents and an arbitrary range of limitations, none of which, in some sense, you chose. It's the cards you're dealt. You know, you're male and not female. You're Hindu and not Christian. You're tall and not short. Now, some of those are cards of privilege. Maybe your parents are rich. Maybe you're born intelligent. Maybe you're born symmetrical. Maybe you're born healthy. All of that, in some sense, is unearned. Now, along with that comes a good dose of existential guilt. Because at the same time, and this is true for anyone, regardless of their cultural background, the ground we walk on is soaked in the blood of historical atrocity.
And the problem of how we should live together in the most productive possible manner, everything considered, is as old as mankind itself. In fact, I would say far older than that, because the same problem bedevils social animals. They have to interact with one another in a manner that sustains the group, because otherwise they all die, obviously, and that sustains the individuals within the group and offers the individuals some scope of action. And so there's a set of implicit constraints on the manner in which creatures interact, or they don't live.
The fundamental truth of the matter is that's best dealt with as a spiritual matter. Is the adversary is within, really, most profoundly. The way you pay for your privilege is with your virtue. I mean that most particularly. And the way you expiate that and atone is by doing your best to live the best possible life you can manage, to speak the truth, to treat people with respect, to abide by the principles of the dignity of the individual, and to put your house in order. If you're lucky and something terrible comes your way and you're reasonably honest and your relationships are in good order, maybe you won't end up in hell. And we all have our privileges and our curses, you know. All of us have that. That's why it's not useful to be envious of people.
I had friends who wanted the best for me and friends who didn't. And, you know, they were friends who, some of them were aiming up and some of them were aiming down. And if you have a friend that's aiming down and you do something that's aiming up, then they're generally not that happy about it, you know.
You see, even in the revelation of their triumph, the initial depth of their despair.
As you start to become successful, let's say, people offer you more and more opportunities. And as you start to fail, people move away from you and you plummet. And so, okay, so that's rough. So what it means is that there is always a landscape of inequality. What that means is there's always going to be people around that are better at something than you are. And that's a problem, because you can get jealous and you can get resentful, and worse, you can get hopeless.
You don't want someone else's fate. Man, your fate's enough, and your adventure's enough. It's plenty. It's more than you can ever fully realize. And if you're in dire straits and dire circumstances, just look at how much opportunity you have to make things better. At least it will help ensure that you won't make the world a worse place. Don't be so sure that your position in your room is so damn trivial. It might be your attitude towards it that's trivial.
Like you have an ethical responsibility to take care of yourself, you have an ethical responsibility to surround yourself with people who have the courage and faith and wisdom to wish you well when you've done something good, and to stop you when you're doing something destructive. Nature was more than a match for us for a very long period of time, right? Our species has come up through epochs, eons of absolute brutal privation, struggle and strife and difficulty, all the entire way through. You know, people striving against odds that are just absolutely astronomical, and yet succeeding. I'm not in favor of the whole there's something wrong with humanity and we're a scourge on the bloody planet, and it would be better off if there were fewer of us, and the whole planet would be thriving if there were none of us at all. I think that there's something unbelievably dangerous about that attitude. Maybe we're smarter than we think we are, and I have a suspicion that that might be the case.